That's funny, I just caught me coughing.
Oh, good. Is it what? Filming?
Yes.
Okay, so should we start?
Yeah, it's already starting.
Okay, well, we're here today to talk a little bit about Donald Trump's choice of Steve Mnuchin as his chief campaign finance person who's going to be in charge of raising the egregious amounts of money that's necessary to launch and be successful in a presidential campaign in the United States these days. And I think it's fair to say that the initial reaction to the choice of Steve Mnuchin was somewhat surprised that Donald Trump would pick someone that on the surface appears to be so dissimilar. And what I'm going to try and discuss today a little bit is that despite maybe a superficial appearance, in reality, Steve Mnuchin and Donald Trump share quite a bit more in common than they're different. And so I've tentatively tied the theme of this little presentation is Peas in a Gilded Pod. And as we'll see, the background, the professional history, the work history, and so forth of Donald Trump and Steve Mnuchin contain far more parallels than they do contrasts and differences.
Okay, but before we start, Andy, could you please tell us a little bit more about who you are, your professional history, and how you know Mr. Mnuchin?
Sure, I'm delighted to, Rick. My name is Andy Grundisse, and my professional background is working as a mortgage-backed securities trader and fixed income arbitrager, also operated a bank. But I got my start on Wall Street at Goldman Sachs, and at the time I was the third person to join the mortgage-backed securities trading desk at Goldman Sachs. And in that connection, I came across Steve Mnuchin at the beginning of his career, because a couple of years after I was working at Goldman Sachs in the mortgage-backed securities department, he too joined the mortgage-backed securities department at Goldman Sachs, and thus I had the opportunity to know Steve from the very beginnings of his professional career.
Great, well, thank you. And this leads to your insight that
in actuality, the careers and the trajectory of Steve Mnuchin and Donald Trump are very similar. And therefore, for that reason, in many ways, Steve Mnuchin was a logical choice for Donald Trump. And in turn, Steve Mnuchin was somebody who would take advantage of the opportunity that Donald Trump offered him to become his chief fundraiser. And really, the parallels begin at the very beginning of their careers. For example, Donald Trump started at Fordham College, which is a college in New York City, and ended up graduating from Wharton. But he was an undistinguished mediocre student. He didn't graduate with honors or anything like that. Steve Mnuchin graduated from Yale, but also without any kind of honors, and typically something like the top 35% of students at Ivy League institutions like Yale graduate with some sort of distinction. So that means that at best, Steve Mnuchin was an average student in college. Donald Trump had his professional start from his father. His father was a real estate developer in New York City, a very prominent one and a very successful one. His specialty was apartment buildings. Steve Mnuchin got his start at Goldman Sachs entirely because of his father, Robert Mnuchin. Robert Mnuchin was a very senior partner at Goldman Sachs and very well liked. And in those days, Goldman Sachs was a partnership rather than a corporation. And this distinction is important because in a partnership, the partners all have complete liability in terms of financial liability for anything that goes on in the organization. And the result of that is that a partner at Goldman Sachs had incredible power because everyone was beholden to him. I remember when I joined Goldman Sachs, the first thing I was told was actually never talk in elevators because you don't know who's in the elevator, so you never have any discussion in an elevator. But the very second thing I was told was that whenever a partner if a partner was to come over and ask me something, or want to talk with me, whatever I was doing, no matter what it was I had to stop doing that immediately and devote my full, undivided, absolute attention to satisfying whatever inquiry or questions the partner had, for as long as that took. And any failure to do that would result in absolutely immediate termination. And Robert Mnuchin, Steve's father, was not just any partner, he was a senior partner. And he was actually very well liked. He had kind of a reputation for a little bit of independence and I guess I would say mild progressivity and rebellion. I didn't work with Robert Mnuchin because Robert Mnuchin was on the equity side of the business and I was on the fixed income side of the business. And all I really remember about Robert Mnuchin was that he had oversized lamb chop sideburns, but in the conforming environment of Wall Street, that was enough to establish him as somewhat of a rebel and somewhat of a nonconformist. When Steve joined Goldman Sachs and joined the mortgage-backed securities desk, and that was a position that there was absolutely no chance in the world that he could have gotten with his background, other than his father's position at the firm. At that time, the mortgage-backed securities trading desks were the most important part of any major Wall Street firm. They generated the most profit. They took the most risk. They had the best and brightest people working for them. It was an extremely competitive area. And just to give an idea, I can remember the people we hired right about the same time as Steve joined the firm. And one of the people that we hired was an African American who was number one in his class at Stanford Business School, for example. Steve doesn't have any graduate education. Not that graduate education is necessarily important, but it's indicative of the kind of talent that we could choose from in staffing the mortgage-backed securities department. The other hire that I remember was a guy that was doing work for a consulting firm for the CIA, and his job was to program marine sea buoys so that they could discern and detect the movement of Russian submarines deep under the surface. And in order to do this, they had to differentiate between large fish and whales, between other large boats, between ocean currents, and so on and so forth. So it was an exceedingly complex kind of a task. And when you look at Steve's background in comparison to these people, I mean, just never would have had a chance of working there except for his father. And so both Donald Trump and Steve Mnuchin got their professional starts in life entirely because of their father's positions. I had a chance to work. This wouldn't be true to say right next to Steve, but in those days, the trading floors were extremely crowded. And so everybody was sitting in a very concentrated fashion. And so Steve sat essentially right behind me. And since people tend to talk loudly, we certainly heard everything that we were saying through those early days. So what I remember about Steve from those days is that he was actually a very soft-spoken guy. Never really threw his weight around. Of course, he didn't have to because everybody recognized that if they crossed Steve in any way, they would be gone. They'd be history. And but I would say that generally, if I had to use one word to describe Steve, I would say, I guess I would use the word milquetoast. He was kind. He wasn't razor sharp. He wasn't razor quick. And this is an environment in which, a really ruthless environment. I think it's been described somewhat effectively by Michael Lewis in his book Liar's Poker. I don't know if many people are probably familiar with that book. It was a New York Times bestseller. And although I wouldn't say that was 100% accurate, I think it does convey a lot of the tone and the attitude and the approach and the personalities. And really, Steve didn't have, I'm not saying it's bad, it's probably a good thing, but he didn't displace those kinds of personality characteristics that would make him a successful trader. Probably moving on in terms of their career, Donald Trump's first big transaction was the purchase of an option on some, was pursuant to the Penn Central bankruptcy in New York City. Penn Central bankruptcy was, up to that time, the single largest bankruptcy in the history of capitalism. And probably, if measured in terms of real dollars, it's probably the largest bankruptcy in modern finance. And of course, Penn Central, because it involved the New York City railroad lines and because of the nature of railroads in general, was very much under the administration and purview of the various government agencies. And so, in effect, Donald Trump went from the family to the government team in terms of doing deals. And in this case, he negotiated for himself a very favorable option on a piece of land on the west side of New York City, and his intent was to develop it as apartment buildings. Of course, it turned out that it was a really bad environment to do apartment building development, and he couldn't get financing for it. And so what ended up happening is he ended up selling the land for a great deal of profit to New York City to be developed as a convention center. So Donald Trump's initial successful transaction involved buying an asset out of government-controlled bankruptcy and then selling it back to another government agency.